Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to the Size of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick, and I'm the producer for the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. The opinions, conversations, and quotations do not in any way represent River West Radio. The persons responsible are solely the producer, guests, and people calling in. Consequently, West Radio is not liable for legal issues arising from the content you're about to hear. So, again, I'm Jacob Glicklick, graduate student at UWM, and joining me for tonight's show is returning guest Randy Miller.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
And first-time guest Bill Reck.
Hello, Jacob and Randy. Thanks for having me.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. So the focus concerns Ayn Rand, the influential novelist, and some would call her a philosopher. That's, I think, done arguably more than almost anyone else to impact on how at least Americans view the economy and what they think the economy is, what they think the economy should be, with her dogmatic, pretty sort of strongly stated views on the ethical purity of unregulated capitalism and the baseness of everything else. So, I mean, we're talking about, in terms of novelists at this point, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged is the most influential work. Also, I think, would argue, had impact just by some of the figures that gathered around her in terms of movement for a period, most notably Alan Greenspan. I guess, but considering it as ultimately a author, what do you think, both of you, make her books, in contrast to some other figures, or even figures that are like similarly, right-wing, more popular, more influential? Why Ayn Rand?
Well, first of all, I don't consider her a real philosopher. I consider her more of a novelist, obviously with a philosophical bent. And even though she would put herself forth as a philosopher, I don't think she makes the cut. I think she's popular for a number of reasons. While I was thinking about this question, I thought about the Third Republic, France. There was a conservative there named Hippolyte Taine. He wrote a really great book on the French Revolution, and he hated the revolution as a conservative. And what he said, the reason why he said the revolution took place, and the reason why it was so disastrous, because the philosophes had sort of promoted a certain epistemology, a certain type of reason that was disastrous. And for him, what the philosophes did is, first of all, they gave an element of a popularization. What I mean by that is, what they were teaching people is that any normal person, any average person has a sort of internal spark that allows them to not have to consult experts on anything. They have the ability within themselves to figure out the most complicated issues. All you needed was a salon back then, and you could pontificate on the most lofty of ideas. And for him, that fomented a political energy that ended up in disastrous effects, of course, during the French Revolution. Now, the funny thing with Ayn Rand is that she humorously thought that she was perfecting the Enlightenment promise of reason. She believed that somehow Immanuel Kant had sort of knocked things off base, and she was going to come in with her silly objectivism and sort of straighten it out. If I can torture this analogy, I'm wondering if she does the same thing for modern certain conservatives with this totalizing and popularization of reason, so that while you had people during the French Revolution who didn't know anything about democracy or about natural rights or about this concept of the people, they were shouting it unknowingly. And I think we see the same thing with many in the Tea Party who talk about things like deregulation, small government, without really knowing what that entails. So I'm wondering if there's a sense in which this legacy is where there's a sense in which this legacy is extremely negative, and perhaps this is one of the effects, a sort of totalizing and a shallow reasoning, giving people the okay to just pontificate.
Do you not want the call?
Or should we put it on? Yeah.
It's up to you. It's your show.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not opposed. No, not opposed in principle. Just didn't want to cut Randy off in terms of mid-statement. So I guess if caller listening on the air, if call back in 5 minutes, we will try to incorporate you.
So if I can just sort of sum up what I tried to say, I think she's popular because she gives the average person the permission to pontificate on big, lofty topics without the worry of not knowing what they're talking about. Fair enough.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that in some ways it's perhaps unfair not to call her somebody who's not a philosopher. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways there's a lot of overlap between how we conceptualize what a novelist is and what a philosopher is, right? All good novels have some sort of, or all sort of, you might say all sort of novels with an aim that goes beyond simple narrative actually helps us to understand the world around us a little bit better. And it provides a critique to that world too. And so I think that in some ways to call Ayn Rand not a philosopher, it might be rather unfair. I think that in some ways this concept of reason is the ultimate arbiter of what reality is, and particularly in terms of her epistemology, right? So how you actually know the things that you know, and then moving that into metaphysics, so the state of your actual being, what you can actually perceive around you. In many ways, I think what reason does there for Ayn Rand is breaks down each of these components into an actual monad, right? So reason breaks down concrete experience into its most individualized components. So how do I know that something is a concrete reality? In a lot of ways, well, can I break it down using reason into that particular concrete reality? And now then, I think that there's some problems with that in terms of how it is that people actually develop the world around them, right? We all know that things don't just kind of come out of nowhere, and you know, we need things outside of our own reason to help us develop our own reason, right? So, I mean, I think in a lot of ways there is a certain philosophy there. Now, I think there's also coming out of and entering the post-Soviet era, I think in a lot of ways to kind of historicize the novel and its rise when it started to become more popular in the United States. So near the end of the 20th century and through the beginning of the 21st, and much of this is spoken to within the Fountainhead, but there is actually a real criticism of the way that certain centralizing bureaucracies, central planning agencies actually limit the ability of human will and human reason, human development, in fact, to actually attain its most lofty goals, right? So, I mean, I think that there's a real sort of critique there that speaks to the ability of the individual to overcome that type of homogenizing and limiting component of the Soviet, particularly the Soviet model.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You can only understand these novels in the context of the Cold War. Absolutely. And I think my disparaging of her being a philosopher comes from the fact that there's nothing really original there. This apotheosis of reason is something that goes in and out of Western thought quite a bit. I mean, starting from Aristotle.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth drawing attention to, I mean, the deep anti-intellectual strand in Ayn Rand's thought. I mean, was it about glorification of reason? Like, as we both said, it's very much about sort of individual, unmediated experience by which, you know, they arrive at a set of the world. I mean, herself, I think Ayn Rand's, you know, approach towards intellectual heritage was more on the level of name calling and vilification rather than legacies. I mean, by her own claim, it was sort of Aristotle was the one figure that was influenced, the one that was worthy. Everyone else was, you know, to be condemned as imposing a twisted,
the evil
altruistic,
collectivist,
altruistic,
Sure.
you know,
And that's
sham job that had been
that's
sold
exactly
to
the
everyone.
point. The point that Hippolyte Taine was making was that there was an anti-intellectualism, an oversimplicity on reality that was going on that caused this French Revolution to happen. And my analogy was trying to say the same thing. They're exactly what you said, there is an oversimplification about reality and how we perceive reality. At the same time, it emboldens people to believe that they do have all that they need. Certainly, they have the reason, but it takes lots of study to understand how complicated those things. And after some of this stuff, one is confident in just throwing out things like deregulate or small government, those types of things, which really are meaningless without understanding the complexities of what those mean.
Yeah.
But they're given meaning.
Well, and given a very attractive meaning. I mean, that's the other thing that, you know, the Ayn Randian vision becomes, I think, one of the reasons for its popularity. Partly, you know, as Bill you mentioned, like you know, particularly taking off after fall of the Soviet Union and the apparent, you know, triumph of capitalism that therefore seeks, you know, a system that gives moral value in taking the capitalist assumptions even further, in going against notion of charity towards other individuals as being you know, contempt for them, so that justifies them, set it up. But also, I mean, if you see in that world, in that place, you know, as an individual, that's a wonderful, you know, sort of sense of, you know, unlimited possibilities for, I mean, of course, I think everyone that sort of, you know, reads Ayn Rand of it and likes and endorses it and rereads it, as I may or may not have done in high school five times over the course of 3 years,
I love those books.
thinks of themselves as, you know, in the loge of the producer, you know, as the sort of, you know, masters, as the great creators. That, you know, of course, that gives a wonderful justification for the frustration of the world. It's a absolute conspiracy and hindrance imposed by people that are trying to drag down and harm, you know, me for my, you know, creative, effective, artistic work, for which I, you know, should of course be a multi-billionaire, as, you know, is, you know, because by virtue of the, you know, great things produced. You know, so I mean, I guess it's less surprising, you know, if I put it that way, that something that, you know, sort of champions the absolute possibility and autonomy and, you know, and self and, you know, virtue in that kind of accomplishment and that kind of financial benefit would be appealing within particularly context of Cold War America and then post-Cold War.
Well, there was this funny email that was going around several years ago. It was a list of things that men over 30 should not do, and one of them, way up there, was read Ayn Rand novels. And I think that's funny for one thing, but I think there's a truth in there, in that people who do read Ayn Rand novels generally are male, and generally are probably in their early 20s, if not in their late teens. And I think that's very telling. The fact that she promises that morality can be objective, which is very appealing to someone who is just starting to face, you know, the complexities of the world. Reality can be objective. It's very much like a religion. I think there's a sense in which it functions like a religion, in the sense that, hey, here's an objective morality for you. Here's a way that you can be sure about all the things in the world, even though it just seems like mass chaos. But that's another reason why those books are appealing.
Sure. And yeah, I mean, not just any particular religion, but a particularly fundamentalist one that's very concerned with, you know, its own inner truth and maintaining sort of dogma and loyalty to Ayn Rand when she was alive, and then the memory of Ayn Rand when she was not alive. And I mean, I guess I would make Atlas Shrugged term as a sort of secular Darwinian equivalent to the Left Behind series, or anything that since it is describing a sort of tribulation, a collapse of society, the fact that, you know, the true, you know, faithful remnant who understand what's going on and are the force of the world are persecuted, but in the end, you know, will emerge victorious and, you know, and really suffer, you know, sort of remarkably little in the way of problems, particularly once, you know, the characters come to realize what's going on and how they have to follow, you know, John Galt and Galt's Gulch and the...
My guess is that there are bigger words in Atlas Shrugged. That was a joke.
So I guess tracing that round again to like the question of the philosophy and novelist, which I don't know, I think is worth juxtaposing them, since actually one Ayn Rand quote that I do like is that you know, if every philosopher were forced to be a novelist as well, to put down in concrete human terms, the implications of their philosophy, there would be far fewer philosophers, but far better ones. But I think it's interesting to juxtapose that to Ayn Rand's writings herself, because among other things, I mean, this pageant for individualism, that anything that goes against the the productive capability and wealth collection of the individual is wrong, is immoral, is driven by evil, hateful people. So the personal ego is all, but at the same time, she doesn't really have the characters that have realized that actually do anything with it. They're extremely, I mean, I think they're extremely flat, monolithic people, particularly once they have the objectivist epiphany and decide to withdraw their work of it, so that the sort of Moocher mentality can collapse. I mean, I think even to the extent that I think that there's more interesting psychological dynamics early on, like in both, more so in Fountainhead than Atlas Shrugged, with characters that are working against their own interests and that are tormented and that are ambiguous, as opposed to the ones that are completely confident what they're doing and suffer no real problems and are not put in danger or severe inconvenience because the opponents are simply envious of their ability and have no actual talent of themselves. So it's easy to escape their captivity even when they're being sort of tortured to produce the engine of the world, as John Galt is. So I don't know. It's ironic that it falls back to such a sort of generic, I think, boring model for what the individual should look like in this philosophy that is all about the glorification of the individual.
Right, and I feel like in a lot of ways too, the way in which that it develops throughout the course of Atlas Shrugged has a lot to do, perhaps with some older notions of what it means to actually have ability, to actually have skill. And what I mean by that is, so when you think about how it is that a lot of times people talk about who deserves to be wealthy, who deserves to have acclaim for the art that they produce. So if we're going to relate this to the Fountainhead as well, oftentimes it's about one's own hard work. It's about one's own ability derived through that hard work, derived through reason, correct? To put up some sort of achievement, some sort of art on a pedestal. And that is something that you can gain reality, your metaphysics from. Yet we have an example of a character in Atlas Shrugged, Eddie Willers, who works incredibly hard, puts in the same amount, really the same amount of hours as Dagny Taggart throughout the novel, Dagny Taggart being the heroine, who ends up with John Galt in the end to create the perfect Randian world. But nonetheless, despite all this hard work that you would think would then translate into ability, that you would think through the use of his reason, through the hard work, would translate into some sort of artistic, in the Randian sense, production. He just dies on a train track near the end of the novel, right? The train just runs him over, he lies down, and that's it.
Yeah, and I guess I wonder if Ayn Rand would say that his fault was actually the loyalty to Dagny Taggart of it, or
Sure.
or the well-being focused and on the right side of it, that he's not simply out marketing himself as much. One of the problems in trying to envision, think like the economy of Galt's Gulch, and even when it's just 50 people that are most talented, of how it's actually supposed to work in the way Ayn Rand's philosophy holds it has to, is tricky. And even on a wider scale, the question of if it is about glorifying these sort of larger than life, or I would say flatter than life in some ways, but sort of superhuman, effective geniuses in the field, then what is supposed to be about the people lower in the rung? What is supposed to happen to them?
The thing is, again, to speak to the unoriginality of Ayn Rand, she is simply Nietzsche with an emphasis on reason rather than will. It's the same outcome. But I'm wondering if there's a mischaracterization of part of her philosophy. I don't think that she would say that anything that takes away your individuality is evil. I think she would say, as long as it's your choice, one could choose to live an altruistic life, and that's fine as long as the force is not coming from outside of that person, as long as there's not a thief, a collectivist who's coming in and taking it when you want it, which I think is a subtle distinction, but I think it's important for making sense of that worldview that she's trying to present. But I would say there's a huge difference in philosophical outlook between Atlas Shrugged and something like The Fountainhead, or even the Anthem, or even Anthem. Um, I, I love those novels. Atlas Shrugged was not my favorite by any means. It was The Fountainhead, and I think what you were getting at, this idea of your production of art. To me, that was what The Fountainhead was about. It was about the relationship between yourself and your art, your work. Well, not even, I won't even say work. Your production, your creative production. And for that, I think it's extremely applicable. I would say it's still applicable. I would adopt it. I would say I would still think these are valuable insights and things that are good ideals. And I think, and also, and one more thing, not only one's creative product, but their personal morality. And throw away her morality of objectivism. But, I mean, I think we would all agree that there's no rational grounding for any sort of morality. I mean, we can't, it's not scientific, we can't find it. It's not something that's given to us. And I think we're left in this sort of Kierkegaardian state where, since we don't have anything telling us what's right and wrong, we sort of have to go out and decide, okay, I'm gonna say this is right and this is wrong, and I'm going to be this, what he would call the knight of faith, and this is the way I'm going to live my life. This is the morality that I choose. And I think what's presented in the Fountainhead is also this: I'm going to live consistent with what I think is right. It doesn't have to be objectivism at all.
Although I think the vision of that still presumes a pretty stark, black and white setup. I mean, forgetting. I mean, even the fact that in terms of what the actual dogma, or if you had the moral principles, have to include, disclaiming any actual empathy for other people, as Ayn Rand's philosophy does. Even within that, I mean, it's still very much a outlook that's against compromise, that's against change, that wants, that the virtue of the heroic individual, the virtue of a Howard Rourke, I mean, is even as stated inside Fountainhead, is that he doesn't actually change, that he doesn't compromise, that he is the same person with the same attitudes.
Right,
day after day, year after year, which I find
his artistic vision, which I think is
artistic vision, and his life as a whole, in his temperament, in his way of dealing with things. I mean, that unlike every other character in the novel, and certainly unlike in terms of his co-worker that started at the same time and ends, as a sort of crush defeated, parasite, that Rourke is the same and doesn't actually alter his vision of it. Even in his romance, he doesn't, sacrifice anything himself. I mean, that's after all, the whole point, that he doesn't have to change in any way, that he simply exists and produces, and in the end, triumphs. I think I find that a frightening concept. I mean, even regardless of what given ideology, the fact that as an individual being so sure, so confident, so determined that you would work against any kind of altering or compromising of vision ever, does appear as a kind of deathless living state that is already
right. In the Fountainhead, the buildings are metaphors for people, and I think that the people, the people there are also, there's something surreal about them. There's something perhaps romantic about them. I don't know how literal she thinks that Howard Rourke is in the novel. I don't know. But like I said, for me, it was about this shooting for an authenticity in one's artistic and moral life. And I think we can all, I assume we would all, that's something we all would shoot for, right? I mean, we want to be authentic individuals. We want to not just simply go along with, the crowd when it comes to art and when it comes to what we love and what we believe and what we think is right and wrong. I think those are positive values. And I think, like, Bill, what you said about, again, this context of the Cold War and the fact that there is a legitimate critique of the forced collective that we saw from the Soviet Union. there is room for there is room for a a a belief in there's room for individualism in one's life. I mean, it's just part of the makeup of reality of being a human.
Yeah, although I think that you're transitioning somewhat. I mean, the question of also what if is there value in this in terms of philosophy or not philosophy or outlook based on novels. I don't know. I mean, I think that even setting aside Ayn Rand's own issues and own compromises that made with that applied, that it was a vision that was critical to the in terms of centralization of Soviet state, but was Ayn Rand was a friendly witness for the House of Un-American Affairs Committee that was very in touch with some of I think worst excesses of right in terms of pro Vietnam War. I mean, very critical of civil rights movement. I mean, it can run through that. That's I don't know. It's certainly an interesting legacy there. But I mean, even beyond that, I mean, at some level, yes, having a not compromising vision, or at least not compromising, in the sake of the corruption or pressure, or not being bought off, holding your ground, having your personal, artistic, political, individual life vision as a positive value. Sure, absolutely. But I don't think any of us, society, needs Ayn Rand in any sense from that. I mean, that's the theme of, I think, the majority of movies made in Hollywood, among other things. I mean, it's the messaging that works constantly, that the person that holds their ground and doesn't give in and is true to themselves, will in the end triumph.
I don't know if I agree with that. I like the idea of people, teenagers in high school, 20-somethings, picking up the idea of wanting to be authentic with their morality, with themselves, and with their artistic expression. I think that's a very valuable thing. I don't. Is it good for society? I don't know. It's good for people. I think. I think those are really positive values to be reinforced, or to be at least have them given to someone who isn't aware. The idea, and here's a spoiler alert, but the idea that this individual blew up his own building is a powerful metaphor. I loved it when that happened in the book. That was just wonderful. I get it. I know. You guys can laugh. That's okay.
No, I was just at the standpoint that we gave a spoiler alert to Rourke blowing up his building, but not to poor Eddie Willis, dying by the side of the road, shrugged. But I mean, larger question of the commitment to personal, vision and accomplishment. I mean, I think that there's that kind of messaging, that kind of ultimately conditioning is happening already, and probably to an excessive degree under consumer society. And I mean, I think that even when put in its most positive value, it's good to be, because of have your own sense of pride and worth of it, is not the most valuable point of reinforcement that would need to happen.
Well, I think it's fair to say, though, that that's one place where Ayn Rand's vision in The Fountainhead differs. I think that in a lot of ways, young people today get all sorts of mixed messages about what it means to have an authentic vision and what it means to work within an economy. So, I mean, the great example of this is obviously the movie Office Space, where the lead character decides that he's only going to work enough to, basically satisfy his need to eat, need for shelter, and that's going to be it, and he's going to work outside, and it's great. And that's something significantly different, and the values contained therein are significantly different than a vision of the world in which one strives against incredible difficulties. Correct. Yeah,
but also in this case with incredible potential. I mean, it's
of
vision, of course, for all the individuals Ayn Rand cares about, and that this philosophy approaches to. Mm-hmm. It's not about being sort of drones or doing not less essential way, but it's about doing the sort of critical things. So I think that round of integrity teaches also the message that if simply you hold out, and if you take away the statist regulation and the envious moochers that are trying to drag you down, then in the end what you will achieve will be greatness, unless of course you aren't a Howard Roark or a John Galtz or a Dagny Tiger, who are apparently, given we see in some cases a good portion of their total life, and they're always presented as different and
Again,
superior to other people.
Going back to that
They have to be-
oversimplified version of the world, you just described it. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's it.
But
Oversimplified it and to the point of being ridiculous.
Right, and I think that's probably one of Ayn Rand's contributions, correct?
Yeah, and I mean,
And because there are these mixed messages about what human potentiality is, and much of it is tied to the economy and the production within that economy. And so, the Randian vision is significantly different from what young people today receive from the culture around them, and it's that the work that they do. Right, you go to school for 4 years, and then you get your job, and then you have a happy family and have nice things, and that's that. You put in your 8 hours, and then that's it. And so, I think that kind of the specific thing that's related to the Randian vision has to do with the concept of sort of this notion of the individual will, the individual's art, and the individual's goal, and of course, separated from the external contexts as Ayn Rand does so, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've kind of stated it's kind of
Yeah.
it's very difficult philosophically. So that's part of where her philosophy kind of goes bad,
Right.
in a lot of ways.
And I guess I also think that partly even the differences of sort of Ayn Randian, like at this point, taking a sort of idealized version of it, that pretending for a moment that some of the the contempt for people weaker than the truly best doesn't happen, but just a notion that everyone should remain true to themselves and should attempt to not give in to other pressure and develop out their own individual capacity in the world. I still think that's in some ways dangerous, partly because it is fully compatible with society. It is a way of people.
Right.
I mean, imagining and prioritizing own success in a way that I think isn't really compatible with meaningful connection with other people in any sense. It's not.
Right, and again, the parallels between her philosophy and Nietzsche's are striking. If one was to live out Nietzsche's ideal for society, for the majority of the population, life would be nasty, poor, brutish, and short. The same for Rand's vision, because as you say, there's no. It assumes that you have all of this talent. It assumes that everyone starts from a blank slate. Everyone starts with the same abilities and moral reasoning and all that sort of stuff, which of course is silly. But now, can I ask you, Jacob, you are someone who stands up very much for what they believe. You go out on the front lines. I see pictures of you with a bullhorn. I see you on videotapes protesting what you believe in. Aren't you a sort of Howard Roark when you're doing that?
A fair bit more anti-capitalist than that
But
would
in
be in
spirit,
context of
in
it.
morality.
No, I don't think so, because again, it's not a matter of.
But
Okay, I mean, I would say that's sort of like the difference between activism, sort of now of it, and sort of the Roark vision, or the setup of it, or Randian vision, or for that matter, most in terms of pop culture movies about individual fighting the system and making meaningful change, is that it's not about individual versus
Certainly.
everyone else in that sense of it. I mean, I think it's the notion of connection with others and.
But what I'm talking about, what to me is the emphasis in the Fountainhead is the connection between one's self and their art and one's self and their morality. Certainly, Ayn Rand would hate you for your beliefs, but the spirit of those characters, what I think it can be taken out and is applicable to people, is this how you live your life, and that is you stand up for what you think is right. You live out your morality. You are out there standing up for what you believe in, and I think that's very, very Roarkian, if I can.
But I mean, also, if we're just taking the brief personal side of it, I mean, I think it's not even Roarkian because it is influenced by other people, because it's in context of other activists, of other people who have done similar things that are, usually in some level trying to mimic the best parts of the behavior of other people I see around me. That it is, I think, imitative and what would be the in terms of in terms of parasitic or attempting to play off. I think even in the context of activism or going from a crowd of it, it's not, people don't do that because they have an absolute inner conviction of themselves, a complete confidence in the world, or at least the people who do, I think, would be extremely frightening. They sort of do it because they're trying to, like any amount of public speaking, like any amount of teaching, an amount of attempting to project yourself out there with a confidence that don't necessarily feel, but that builds up to an ability to, make an impression on other people and hopefully change the world in a positive way. There's different degrees and nature of that, but I see sort of just a lot of continuity, in terms of with any amount of kind of education or engagement with the public. Whereas, the Rorkean vision is not about the public, since that's either doesn't exist or something that's hostile. It's simply a matter of defending you and yourself and your own personal position and or put it more positively, your dream of what kind of building should look like that you would rather blow up rather than see compromised or tainted.
Fair enough.
So I guess also, the other thing with talking about sort of, the fact that this doesn't happen in a blank slate, but that the Ayn Rand novels now do flow along, I think, some pretty specific political trends. Do you think? I guess from what we talked about with this before, Randy. Do you think? You said that you think the Tea Partiers are misreading Rand, or that are applying in a way would not have envisioned?
Well, I think. Well, again, I'm just throwing out the Tea Partiers because that's sort of the thing everyone talks about now, and they're easy to pigeonhole, I guess. They're easy to be unfair to, I think. But certainly, look, the Tea Parties, within the Tea Party, there are legitimate hardcore libertarians. That is, they are socially progressive. They hate war. They don't think the government should be involved in marriage. All peaceful behavior should be allowed. There's no religious conservatism. Then there's the other half, which is extremely very far to the right, politically or economically and socially, so that they're very religious, and there's that combination of religion and politics that can be so dangerous. But I think certainly Ayn Rand would denounce the Tea Party in all its forms. There's a libertarian party that is very similar to the Objectivist Party, and Ayn Rand condemned them because she felt they were morally subjective. So objectivism does not allow itself to like anything other than itself. So I think if Rand were alive, she would certainly condemn. She would condemn, them, and I certainly think that most of. Look, any idea, any book, we use it the way we want to. We take, I like the stuff that I took from the Fountainhead is different from what you took from the Fountainhead, and but to have a big thick book, on your side is probably appealing to a lot of people. I've seen videotapes of Paul Ryan holding up Atlas Shrugged, saying this is the blueprint, So my guess is that I don't know if he actually read it or not.
And a fair point that Ayn Rand's own sort of dogmatic approaches and the dividing off the group in terms of which movements or ideologies or novels were more evil than others would probably have meant unlikely to identify closely with the other group. But at the same time, some of the links, I think some of the drawing it you probably have read it or read. Read through, and there's the portions that remember is, among other things, the assumption that any economic liberalism, any regulation of the economy tends towards Stalinism. The idea, the fact that, in Galt's where they're going around and describing, all the reasons that caused them to join Galt's little rebellion and leave the world and have everything turn, past the point of redemption, so that they had to remove themselves from the world and to remake it was, socialized medicine was the was the obligation, was forcing in terms of doctors to cater to the sort of undeserving.
And of course, whoever reads Atlas Shrugged, of course, they belong in the Gulch, right? In the Gulch, they belong there. Of course, I would end up there. I wouldn't be one of the people who actually needs help.
Of course,
Right.
Yeah, as I said, and of course, the fact that can be reading at this point and be championing it becomes the sort of proof. Because I mean, that's since it's so it's like so vague in terms of what actually makes sort of the authentic, productive visual. I mean, just being able to recognize that and think that you're invincible of it, under Ayn Rand's vision, I think does mean you might actually be sort of superhuman producer that drives the
But
world.
what about Atlas Shrugged? And this is something we've talked about quite a bit in the office. What about Atlas Shrugged as utopia? And what value does utopia have, if any, other than just being entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely large portions that are utopian. I mean, in terms of in suggesting both a alternate vision of the world that sort of Ayn Rand sort of lived in, that was thought as more desirable, and also a commitment by showing people in the novel who are at least utopians, who do wish to remake society in a drastic way. And I think that generally is that element, the utopian dimension of political thought, of culture, is something that could use more of, but again, preferably not. So right wing utopia. I mean, that's moving in exactly the opposite direction that's effectiveness. We need left wing utopias, we do need alternative visions to, I'd say, the rather horrible and increasingly dystopian present day context that surrounds us, that actually do have a notion of connecting with people, as opposed to the 50 best going off and having the rest of the world crash. And that's kind of interesting in terms of like the idea of like mass producing the Ayn Randian vision, since even by its own logic there would be major problems with that. I mean, I'm reminded of the scene within Shrugged where after Hank Reardon has been sort of persecuted by people trying to drive away his ability to make the profits that is his Ayn Rand given rights of it, but he's by people who are claiming the public good as a justification for dragging him down. So he gives a long speech against the whole concept of it, ending with and the public good be damned, and then all the regular citizens that are in the courtroom just applaud him, and he turns in surprised. But I mean, that's part of, I think, the fantasy, or sort of the power trip, or the utopian dimension, or what makes it most appealing, I think, for teenagers in early 20s. Yeah. I mean, but you get to have it both ways. You get the idea of being able to call out the crowd, denounce any concept of sacrificing and giving to others, and then have people laud you for it, of having it be sort of immensely popular and rewarding and be praised and heroic for that. That you get to have the crowd, once you show at the point that you have no interest in other people's, feelings, and are completely indifferent to even their well-being or success or not, but by having that attitude, is what ensures there will be collective well-being for everyone, and you will be praised for it. So it's a kind of a neat internal psychological trick. That's partly I think what
I assume that she assumes an invisible hand. I don't know, which I guess for her would solve that. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, even beyond, I think you could imagine concept by which the producers of the world had to exist, and be alone and unrecognized. But her notion, you can have it both ways. They can be recognized, that they can be praised for saying, public good be damned, and that. Well,
right? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well, if I remember correctly, the way Atlas Shrugged ends, I think you pointed this out once, Jacob, that it perhaps is more dystopian than utopian. You're left with 50 people creating their own society amongst a destroyed economy and people suffering, and sounds dystopian.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of what's supposed to happen next after this next chapter of it, after they make an announcement to return to the world, that things have gone to the point where without their effort, Dagny Taggart was the one person that was holding the society sort of together, and once she left, it was like another week tops before it collapsed entirely. But then they're supposed to come back and never be taxed again. I mean,
and be dictators.
Well, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's
Yeah.
the sort of specific things they do, is like Congress shall make no law, regulating commerce in any form of it. But even by their own vision of it, they would think that it's, the 2 weeks later, another one of sort of moochers will be coming out and stirring people up and trying to, take away sort of revenue. At that point, do they just leave again, or does the fact that everyone having heard Galt's, 2-hour speech mean that they're not going to be persuaded anymore?
Maybe that's why she stopped the way she did. That's why she stopped on page 1300.
Right, because who's going to produce the stuff that, they're actually making?
Yeah.
Yeah, or I guess, even if taking this as utopian setup, I mean, how do families happen at that point? I mean, how is that compatible? I mean, compatible with young children? I mean, that doesn't have sacrifice, that's.
Well, again,
I guess they're in your.
she doesn't have a problem with choosing to sacrifice. The problem comes in when you're forced into altruism. You can choose to live however you want as long as it's your choice. That's how I understood her.
But then, so that's your choice at a certain point of it. That after a year and a half of the young child, does not seem to be shaping to be the productive individual and is making more claim on on your own talents and energy. So
that reminds me. Did you see The Simpsons where they had to take little Maggie to a daycare and they found the Ayn Rand School for Tots?
No, I didn't.
Oh, it's so great. Look it up. They take her in there, and there's on the wall there's A equals A, and the woman who's running it's really mean looking. It's funny.
Yeah.
Anyway. Bill.
So, I think that the utopian element of it, or the idea of thinking alternatives and having.
What's the difference? What's the difference between a novel that presents a utopia, a political utopia, and a novel that presents an ideal, a political ideal?
I'd say an ideal, it could be someone making a speech about it. A utopia is something that actually shows the society. So
what?
Right. I mean, a utopia would show the functions of the society.
I mean, has an effect on the reader.
I'm sorry?
As the effect on the reader. If a novel presents an ideal, is that a legitimate bit of information to guide one's politics, as opposed to if you're presented with a utopia, can that guide?
Oh, sure. I mean, it can. Both can function, and generally, I think the ideals would have more, or even at the level of speech or principle or inspiring character, or even inspiring key plot moment, is more likely to be effective, since most actual utopias tend to be somewhat dull because they have an absence of conflict and drama to the same extent. So that they.
But utopia, when people grasp utopia and mistake it for an ideal, that's when you get totalitarianism. That's when you get, our Marxist utopia, this future perfect state of communism, justifies anything we do now, or whatever. It's a political religion, because you know where you're going. This is what you're shooting for. So if that's the case, we can do anything we want to anyone for the greater good.
Yeah, and they certainly can be. But I guess turning that part to the earlier discussion, it's commonly, in terms of, certainly I think in pop culture, a way of reading in terms of the left and utopianism in the left is to point to the Soviet Union and then laugh and then assume that it sort of discredits or to use that as in terms of with varying degrees of showing that however flawed sort of the conventional capitalist, imperialist, racist patriarchy might be, attempts to substantially remake it, or even just, having the vision of substantially remaking it, risks totalitarianism and things like that. I'd say that the danger is less trying to make a substantive break than in terms of ideologues that are far too confident in their own ability to it. I think that the problem is not having enough self-scrutiny or criticism, and that's what leads to a problem. In that sense, not even as much the effort of utopia is bad, but the lack of critical space to imagine, let's say, different utopias, to imagine different tactics moving towards utopia, is when you tend to have the problem, because when you have the top-down attempts to impose control over other people, which with Leninism, as with capitalism, tends to
don't
be
use that.
making decisions for other people with the assumption that it will end up being in their own long-term interest because they're ultimately not clever enough to decide for themselves. That tends to end in blood and violence for both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of those things that you kind of wonder about the question of how Ayn Rand actually conceptualized capitalism too, because we've kind of been hitting on how it is that the individual vision and doing what's right within one's reason is supposed to bring about this type of capitalist utopia in a lot of ways. And what we've actually seen historically is that these are types of economic systems, cultural systems, both in capitalism and under Stalinism, in Marxism and various regimes that, these are all things that have to be imposed from the top down. It's all a form of social control. And so I guess I'm wondering about how it is that Ayn Rand actually is conceptualizing capitalism as an external historical concept. There's actually no history despite her claim for empiricism.
Yes, right? And I think this is the same thing that the certain portion of the right has adopted, this assumption that capitalism sort of is pre-existent to government, that it's like a natural, it's like has the status of a natural right, that it just exists in nature, and what the role of the government is merely to reinforce what's already there, rather than capitalism does not exist except for the infrastructure of law that comes down from on top. So again, you're totally right. I think a complete mischaracterization of, and she was by no means an economist.
Yeah, and even more specifically, talking historically, it's been on record, both in own sort of speeches and essays, and within Atlas Shrugged, of proclaiming that the 19th century was the greatest. That was the greatest achievement. that vision of labor relation was how it should, in terms of unregulated economy, how it should happen. So it says there was some issues with slavery and some problems. On the whole, it was a better vision than once the statists got in and started enslaving everyone for their own interests, which becomes possible because I think it has the anti-intellectual trait, and the disdaining of empirical examples that don't disagree with her fundamental premises.
Well, I think what you
Oh, go ahead.
What you mentioned it before, and I think it's the narrative that comes out from Hayek and von Mises. Again, this is the context is the Cold War, and the narrative is this: if the government gets involved in the economy in any substantial way, even though it might bring present good, ultimately what you will have is some sort of totalitarianism. That is the end result, and that, of course, seems to be justified throughout the Cold War, and that's where all this picks up steam. I think that is the narrative that holds lots of people in thrall, and why people seem to make those decisions that don't make that much sense. There's how many millions of people without health care, the government can't do anything because we're going to end up as a totalitarian regime. That narrative needs to be broken down, that needs to be challenged, because it hasn't worked out that way. Western Europe, right? The government gets involved in the economy and they don't have totalitarian systems. So, but...
Right. The government is involved in the economy in the post-World War II period, right? It's the greatest flattening out of the distribution of wealth, at least for a lot of white folks. So... Yeah, the idea that the government being involved in the economy in certain ways is going to lead to totalitarianism is absolutely a myth. And I think everybody knows that too.
And I'd say that perhaps in some ways that society that we have now that's so determinately anti-utopian, anti-experimental, accepting the status quo, but it also has a lot of, in terms of both popular culture and politicians that are either mouthing elements from sort of Ayn Randian philosophy or genuinely believe it, is what encourages a sort of anti-empirical extremism and a just disdain for reality that leads together with tightening some police controls and a lot of other things. I would argue makes society a bit more totalitarian. So I guess maybe just closing up a bit. Final comment or?
I was just going to say the reason why I brought that up is because I think that explains why she was so intense with this argument. that, you know, you can't have any involvement because of that
Yeah.
narrative that came out
Oh,
of the
sure.
Cold War. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so there's a historical context, even if, you know, the Ayn Rand individual doesn't, you know, need to recognize it. You know, we still think we sort of do, ultimately. So with that, I think we'll wrap up tonight's session. Encourage any interested parties to stay on if you want to hear Killer Radio Show. That'll be going from 8 to 10. And as well, the Size of Thoughts Conversations, the Lives of History graduate students will be back again next week, Tuesday at 7 o'clock for discussion on visual culture of Milwaukee. Thank you for joining us.
Good.